James Roberts is someone who has a true appreciation for life and everything he's been given in it. He has two missions in life: to break down barriers and to make a positive difference. He's a transformational coach, helping his fellow amputees lose 10 to 30 pounds in 90 days while still eating their favorite foods. He was born with a congenital disability called femoral dysplasia. He spent some time, over a decade, competing as an elite level Paralympic athlete for Great Britain in swimming, rowing, and sitting volleyball. During his decade of competition, he participated in 4 World Championships, 1 European Championship, and 2 Paralympics. James joined me this week to share his uniquely personal story and so much more. I'm Kevin McShann. Let's have this conversation. Roberts kicked off the interview by reflecting upon his appreciation for his journey and what sport has meant to his overall quality of life.
Well, mine, Kevin, is slightly different probably to most Paralympic athletes, and I think obviously the adversity aspect of it is no different, but I started off in mainstream sport, so it wasn't until I was probably about 15 years old that one of my coaches then approached me and I said, what are your thoughts about doing disability sport? Obviously, I wasn't very happy hearing that comment. And obviously, back in the early 2000s, I think Paralympic sport and disability in general is looked down upon by the mainstream. And because I was very much in that bubble, I looked at it in the same way. It's like, well, why am I going to do something that I deem beneath me in no uncertain terms? And obviously it does pain me to say that now, 19 years on, that I don't think like that anymore. But obviously it wasn't in the media as much as it is now. And it's obviously, when you don't understand something, you're going to persecute it. You're going to very much look to ostracize it, because it's like, well, I don't know what it is, so I'm going to keep it at arm's length. But in terms of obviously progressing to the what you mentioned in the introduction, to going on to 4 World Championships and to represent my country on the pinnacle of what Olympic sport or Paralympic sport is, I probably never thought in my wildest dreams that would ever come true. I thought maybe, a long shot one, but to have the illustrious career that I had over 10 years, I'm very thankful. And I've had times where I've questioned family, I've questioned myself. Well, why me? Why am I disabled? At many occasions throughout my life. But I think that's one where I'm actually grateful for it, because ultimately, I don't speak to you today if it's not for those accolades. I don't have a platform of influence if it's not for my disability. And it's one that I don't think it's ever held me back. It's never been viewed as a negative and I must feel sorry for myself. It's been very much a positive as, okay, you've been dealt this hand. How do you evolve? How do you adapt? How do you rebound and get off the canvas time after time after time? So I think obviously this situation of COVID is no different. I've had to evolve my business and adapt to people being in lockdown and things like that. And I've risen to the challenge quite well. Maybe some of the able-bodied trainers have kind of thrown in the towel. It's like I can't survive in this climate. I think this is where the disability has been a kind of a blessing. It's like, well, and it's obviously one that you can which everybody has on a daily basis in some way or some kind. I think it brings it home that, okay, this is just something else.
And tell me, how do you think you've grown over the last decade in your current circumstance and viewing the world through a different perspective?
That's a great question, Kevin. I think it's always looking to reflect, and I think it's an ongoing process, even beyond the last decade, because ultimately, us as human beings, when we shed skin, shed that dead skin, we're not the same person every single day that we wake up. So I think if people looked at it into that little, really, really in depth, that like we were talking about off air of painting your canvas, you have that opportunity every single day. And I think I very much like to teach that to my clients and people that come into my inner circle. It's like you create what you want to of that day, that time that you've got. And I think obviously that's an evolutionary process that I've looked to go internally at times to be able to improve. Obviously, with Black Lives Matters and being of mixed race, I've had to look inwards. Well, okay, where do I fit in within society? I was watching a great documentary called The Australian Dream, of looking at the Aborigines and how they've been, in a sense, persecuted in Australia. So it got me to look at obviously my white side of the family as how do I fit in from that basis. So I think this reflective state is one you've got to look at from time to time. And I think, to answer your question more specifically, how has that evolved over the last decade plus? I think I'm very more open-minded to try different things, to look at mindfulness, meditation, like the holistic side of things, on top of the mainstream of wellness.
And tell me, in terms of running your businesses, someone someone with a disability, how has that been for you from an operational perspective? And I'm wondering if you can provide sort of a roadmap of prosperity from your perspective of running a business.
Oh, to answer that question, that's not too difficult, because obviously I've evolved from being a very much in-person business about 5 years ago up until about 3 years ago, to I went completely online. To obviously I could see the faults within just sending out programs, and there's no real accountability with the other individual. So I was very much missing the face-to-face interaction that we didn't have because of lockdown. It's like, okay, how do I evolve and adapt my business? Let's go virtual. And people have been biting my hand off for that opportunity, because that's given me the opportunity to work with people all around the world. So I've got clients on the East Coast of the United States. So they got to check in first thing in the morning to get my afternoon. And obviously the ones over here, I've got a little bit more say on the time of day they work, because they're in the same time zone. But I think, to give some concept to people, that's an evolution in business. It's seeing where there's a gap in the market. It's looking at what do people want. Obviously, people were longing for connection. Zoom, Skype, Microsoft Teams. Obviously, not just down to those three companies, but obviously you got your other ones as well. And looking at how can you tap into that ideal client. Obviously, you got to speak to them, if you don't have that client base to work from already, and then obviously listening to every struggle they've got, every piece of advice. Ultimately, other than yourself, they're probably your harshest critics, and it's being willing to be receptive of that, because ultimately that's going to make you grow as a person and especially as a business. Because if you don't give that person a positive experience, thus a journey, you're not going to get a testimonial, you're not going to get a good appraisal, and ultimately they're not going to refer somebody else to come work for you. So it's very much looking at like Apple's model of the consumer is the most important, not the technology in that case. And it's looking at, obviously for my business, the client, the consumer is the most important, and you build the product around them. And obviously that's as things come into play and you listen, then you add little bits on and a little bit extras or stuff you can take away, and that can be a standalone for maybe somebody that doesn't have, obviously the objection of income does come up occasionally. Okay, this piece of material or resource I think will be straight up your street, and obviously you've got something to be able to fit that gap. So obviously it comes down to, first and foremost, conversation and being able to be a very people person. And obviously if you can't do that, you're going to struggle.
And tell me, I know it hasn't always been easy for you in sort of arriving at this positive mindset mind frame. So I'm wondering if you can expand a little bit more about your disability and how you overcame obstacles.
My disability, Kevin, is called femoral dysplasia. So I am missing my femur bone. I don't have at all, which is the top portion of my leg. I've got a small tibia and fibula, which is in the bottom half of the leg. And how I describe it, because obviously for people listening, it's a nightmare to be able to visualize, is I'm congenital, but I explain it to, obviously, able-bodied people as an amputee because they know what it is, and obviously I wear a prosthetic leg. So to keep it in like layman's terms, I'm missing half of my leg.
And how do you, what's your best advice for someone looking to sort of overcome their own obstacles in life based on your own lived experience?
Okay. I think this is relatable to disability or not. Obviously, get out your own way, because ultimately that's probably at the end of the day, the only person that stands in your way is you, because obviously you're going to have your haters, your naysayers. Those people will never go away. And ultimately, obviously you can do something about that. Be it, obviously my case was sport. I soon shut people up when if I beat them, put them in the place. Like, there you go. Not only have I beaten you, I'm also missing a limb. And obviously when I've gone into the Paralympic space, it's been an adjustment, but how I speak to obviously other disabled people now versus when I first came into it is completely different, because ultimately when I first went in, you can't say this, you must be PC, and some of the language that disabled people use towards each other as just sarcastic and sarcasm is very dark. And ultimately I did this not too long ago with my personal training peers. We were away at a retreat with our business coach, and obviously he's coming from a military background, and obviously women first, there's no children around. So I came up with this comment, shouldn't the cripple be next? But I've kind of obviously made a light-hearted joke of, in a different space, is very on PC, but I've normalized it, because ultimately if I'm comfortable with my disability, everybody else is going to be. But I think if we delve deeper than that, I think that's probably a mindset that's instilled from a generation perspective, it's a learned behavior from my mother, and also my grandmother that had a big impact on my upbringing, and obviously her generation were fighting in World War II. So, okay, this is where I'm going with this. Is relatable to COVID, because ultimately, well, they could see their enemy, but they wouldn't know night after night whether or not they'd come. So obviously, there's that fear and terror that's probably in the psyche, but they got on with it and they kind of pushed through and kind of built this resiliency to, which is not a good thing in one reflection, is they internalized a lot of things and then pressed on. But I think that's a lesson I learned as, okay, you're going to face adversity in life. How do you react to it? You have two choices. You either let it smack you in the face and you lie on the canvas and you stay down, or you pick yourself up and you go again. And ultimately, I could use the Rocky quote: "Nothing's going to hit as hard as life," and that's true. It's fact. It's ultimately, you are in control of your own destiny. There's going to be obviously a story that you tell yourself that's going to have an outside impact on it, but ultimately, you have all the choices. You have all the cards, and you can decide whether or not you play them or not.
Now, following up on that, from a societal perspective, if there was one thing fundamentally that you wish other people without disabilities could conceptually wrap their arms around about the treatment of people with disabilities, what would that be?
Well, that's an amazing question, Kevin. I've never thought about it that way, because ultimately they can't relate to you as a disabled person, because even if it's a loved one, they don't know how it feels to, I don't know, have a leg missing, have an arm missing, to be in a wheelchair, to have cerebral palsy. Obviously, the list is endless. To have a spinal cord injury. I think until you have to face that shortcoming and experience it for yourself, then that's when you really can relate. Because I think, yes, there's times where people are going to be on their crutches and they can kind of see what it fits, but that's a little bit of a short term. You're not going to be on crutches long term, and I think ultimately, I think it comes down to us as the individuals to normalize how we speak about it, how we treat each other, how we best represent ourselves, like morally and ethically, and that's irrespective of disability. I think obviously you ask a great question, that they should look at us probably in a different light, but that's going to take time, because we're talking about, probably less than 50 years that, the word spastic was being branded about in a very derogative way. So I think as a society, we've got a lot of discussions to sit down and contemplate over. I think Black Lives Matter has brought one issue to the table, but obviously the issue with discrimination towards disability affects every race. And ultimately, the total disregard for people parking in handicap spaces or disabled bays, that is something that people need to look deep down, probably morally. You should probably be disgusted with yourself for doing that, because ultimately I'm not that limited in my walking ability, but somebody that is very, very what's the word I want to use, disabled or handicapped, that can't do the distances from getting from one end of the car park to the store, just because you were waiting for somebody. And this is a Facebook post that I've seen recently. you are just going to be a moment in this. That's a total disregard for another human being.
So, yeah, and I'm also curious to know what is your favorite part of competing and representing your country? What do you get out of it from an adrenaline standpoint or just an overall happiness standpoint?
That's another great question, Kevin. I've never thought about it from an adrenaline rush perspective. It is euphoric because, as I think anybody singing a national anthem before a sporting event, national holiday, you get a buzz. But obviously, you magnify that probably by, I don't know, tenfold, 100 times, and having the actual uniform of your country in this respect to obviously sport and not military. I think it brings a sense of great delight that obviously all the sacrifices over the countless years were all worthwhile. I think if we talk about the differences of the sports that I did, I think if we looked at the last one with volleyball, with my name being on the back, was quite unique because you kind of be able to put your family front and center in the public domain. It's like, well, I'm proud of not only representing my country, but I'm proud to have this opportunity to put my family on the map and be very much one to do the same with where I come from, obviously where I reside now. It was, even though I spent long periods of time in South Wales for university, or obviously in England, in London, or just on the outskirts for different sports, where my mother came from, it's like, well, it's a small seaside town, but I'm proud of where I've come from. So I think it gives you that sense of, I don't know, really. It's quite hard to explain and put into words because I come from a long line of people that have been in the military. So I think for me, it's been one way of fitting in one way or another, just in a different way, as I've represent my country, not on the battlefield, but in the trenches of sport. And I'm not looking for any kudos from my family. And obviously they're very, very proud of me for whatever that I was able to accomplish. But it's nostalgic to be able to go back down memory lane and to, remember these occasions where obviously not very many people get the opportunity to do it. So I think it does bring a mixture of emotions to the table, if I'm honest. And that's probably a fair reflection to give you an honest answer on that question, Kevin.
Fascinated to ask you this next question because I think coming straight from an athlete's mouth holds more weight. So, could I also ask you about what you think needs to be done to further support? And I don't want to use the word better, so I'll use the word further support Paralympic athletes in general.
I think it's going to come down to the TV, the media, obviously the sporting giants of Nike and Adidas are starting to sign athletes to athlete contracts. But when you do speak to Paralympic athletes that I have the opportunity to do so, and they'll speak to their Olympic counterparts, there is still a divide in what that person is going to get for a sponsorship deal, which in this day and age is still ridiculous. But I think obviously we as Paralympic athletes have been striving and fighting probably for decades to be just seen as equal with our able-bodied counterparts. I think there's still a way to go. Obviously on the sporting field, it's there. because I think London 2012 has definitely helped that, because it's brought the spotlight of the sacrifice, the achievement of a Paralympic athlete, just in the day-to-day struggles that they have to overcome on top of the adversity of the sport. And obviously people have kind of said, okay, well, they're just as good in some cases, if not better, than an able-bodied counterpart. And that's no gripe at any Olympic athlete. It's probably to a certain extent true, because you're going to have to fight stereotypes. You're going to have to fight persecution, is probably a strong word, but prejudice at some point of your life as a disabled person. Obviously, the ones that make it into sport have utilized it as fuel to propel them forward. Obviously, it's an axe to grind to a certain extent, and that's my words and nobody else's, because it was evidently true. When I was a teenager, I used comments of teachers, a lot of able-bodied people. It's like, okay, I'm going to prove you wrong. I'm not going to be a failure, and you just watch and see what happens. But I think, obviously, when it comes to maybe the US more in particular, I think more can be done, because I think as a Paralympic nation, it punches way under its own, I won't call them aspirations, but its own actual potential. I think it doesn't deliver as well as it should do, but that obviously comes down to finding the individuals. It's inspiring people to take up these different array of sports. It's giving them, obviously, first and foremost, the opportunity. But it's going to take, obviously, these special individuals in some cases, and they are able-bodied coaches. That, oh, have you, obviously mine was an able-bodied coach. I sent her son a message a couple of weeks ago. I appreciate what your mom did for me, because ultimately, even though I rebelled against it, I sat down and reflected on it. Well, what have I got to lose by at least rolling with it and kind of seeing where this is going to take me, this journey? Because ultimately, did I envision where I got to 5 to 10 years on? No, but I was willing to give it a shot. And I think for anybody that is listening that is disabled, it's probably easier than it was back in my day, because the internet was dial-up. Obviously now you've got the internet at your fingertips. It's a lot easier to find things if you type in the right thing into Google. And ultimately, obviously the size of the United States versus where I live in the United Kingdom, it's a lot easier to be able to travel from one end of the country to the other. I'll give that as face value. It's true, but ultimately, it comes down to how much do you want it, and ultimately, if you want to be a professional athlete, which I'm not saying most kids, in general, a lot of kids that are sporty, irrespective of their disability, want to be professional athletes. Here's your opportunity to make that a reality.
Fantastic. And my final question for you is, what would be your parting message in terms of promoting inclusion, equality, and fairness, both in athletics for people with disabilities and just generally in life as well?
That's a great question. I'm going to come at a different angle to answer this, because ultimately you have, and like I said earlier in this show, you've got two choices. You can either let this be kind of to give you a chip on the shoulder, or you rise above it. And ultimately, it's going to help that you do rise above it, because ultimately that prejudice isn't going anywhere. Obviously, racism is not good. Prejudice towards disability is not ideal, but obviously that comes down to ignorance, and to a certain extent, obviously, I'm not condoning racism, but if a person's never been brought up around multiculturalism, they don't know how to speak about it. So ultimately, you can go two ways with that. You can be resentful, use it as fuel like I did as a teenager, and ultimately, and you might like this one, Kevin, go to the dark side and kind of use Star Wars and kind of be, oh gosh, I can't think of his name, Darth Vader, and kind of be like that. Or do you want to be a little bit more humble and ultimately, yes, it's not right that I'm being persecuted in this way, but use it as a positive. It's like, okay, let me be be a vehicle for change. And if I take the positive route and to be look at to, or be better than, and not to look to belittle, I think everybody wins.
Fantastic, David. I want to take a few seconds to thank you for sharing your inspirational story with us this morning and for joining us. I really enjoyed that conversation and want to thank you for your time today.
Oh, it's my absolute pleasure. And thanks again, Kevin, for having me on.